TRIPS waiver and developing countries, the larger South, is something that is going to go forward through next 4 seminars. And we are trying to organize and focus on these series of events which are going to focus in a major way on how South-South cooperation, access to vaccine, and how the issues that are related to its production, distribution, equitable access, all are to be sort of addressed, and how we can really be part of. Our idea at the South Center and RIS is that though this seminar series is led by Southern institutions or institutions that relate with South, but it is not just about South. It is as much about citizens and citizenry across North. We are seeing that exclusions are happening not just in South, but in several of the Northern communities as well. So it's about the humanity as a whole. And the questions are quite pertinent in terms of how we go forward. But the five sort of focuses that we have chosen for this seminar, I would come on that a little later. But let me just quickly mention that the 4 series seminar that we have thought of, the first one is today on 5th June, when we are going to focus on broad issues with TRIPS waiver. But the next one is on 12th June, when we are focusing this more in a regional perspective and focusing on Africa. So South Center and RIS would get the speakers together, focusing on the regional dimension of Africa. On 19th June, we would focus on Latin America, and 26th June would be with ASEAN countries, where we would try to see how the regional perspectives across next 3 seminars would bring in TRIPS waiver and regional processes that are there. Now, friends, as we see and we are aware, almost 57 countries supported India and South Africa's proposal. The idea has this week been also endorsed by the BRICS. The foreign ministers of BRICS countries met on Tuesday, and they have endorsed the proposal that South Africa and India had come up with. In addition to supporting this proposal, they have also called for access and equity in medical products. They have talked about affordability and also about distribution of diagnostics, therapeutics, medicines, and of course, vaccines. So the spectrum that BRICS countries, while the External Affairs Minister of India, Dr. Jaishankar, was briefing, mentioned about the wider spectrum. And that applies to the revised proposal as well and how we go forward. But as Leena was mentioning, the counter proposals have started pouring in, and they are also bringing in different proposals and different ideas that are there. In our view, the issues are in terms of how the revival of multilateralism that the Biden administration gave us hope of is going to be relevant. Are we going to go ahead with revival of WTO as is being widely expected, and the support that the South and other northern countries have come up with, would they deliver? And there the question is of reformed multilateralism. How to see that WTO really delivers on the new realities that the world is grappling with. So the TRIPS waiver and its effective way forward also would depend on the way we are looking at wider relevance of WTO. In today's seminar, 5 questions are of great importance to us. And while I was discussing with Carlos and Ravi, we thought of these 5 questions. And of course, we have extremely competent chair today. We could not have got better. Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, who was India's ambassador to WTO. But apart from that, he is also a leading authority in India on WTO matters and has been taking very keen interest. So we requested him to chair this. And each one of our panelists today are accomplished in their own right in terms of how TRIPS is to be addressed. And the chair would introduce them. But let me just quickly place these 5 questions here together, and then we can go forward. The first and foremost, which our civil society has been raising, is in terms of compulsory licensing. Isn't that an option? And why we are waiting for TRIPS waiver? Just go ahead with compulsory licensing and we can do that. Is that really a viable proposition? And should we really exercise such a proposal? That's our first question. The second, of course, is TRIPS waiver a charity? Why it is not coming as an effort that the world community should have done that. The third is in terms of how the revised TRIPS proposal is going to help, as the text is already out and we are discussing it in different platforms. The fourth question is about the inputs that are required, like for instance, the mRNA patent spectrum that is there, or access to raw material, and even other dimensions. So like the US Industry Association said that it doesn't matter whether TRIPS waiver is given, but these countries don't have access to raw material. They don't have platforms to produce. They don't have capacity to produce. So what is the point in giving TRIPS waiver? And is that correct? In your assessment, is TRIPS waiver a hollow promise, or is it the first step in the direction for access to vaccine? And our fifth and the last question, of course, hovers around that question of how the southern countries, the countries that require vaccine on an affordable price, can ensure production capacities to be ramped up, and that to be done in near future. So how the question of finance, investment, and domestic production capabilities are linked. And here our suggestion the other day to IMF during a meeting on South-South cooperation day before yesterday was that IMF should come up with a new window for financing health sector related pandemic financing, which should ramp up this production capacity. Once we do that, then we are, of course, going to go forward with these 5 questions. Our effort was to get academics and civil society organizations and governments together. I'm extremely glad that Ambassador Carim has joined us from South Africa. So without further ado, now I invite Chair of this session, Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, to lead us through this discussion. And once again, thank South Center for partnership in this series. So, Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi. It is indeed a great pleasure to be amongst such very distinguished experts on TRIPS issues who have all earned a huge name for themselves in this field as researchers, as advocates of various aspects of TRIPS liberalization. I appreciate the 5 questions that you have raised, because you have already lightened my burden about trying to have some kind of a focused discussion on the various aspects of the TRIPS waiver. As you have mentioned, the next few sessions are going to be continent-specific: Africa, Latin America, and Asia. So this then, as the curtain raiser, is going to be very important as a session, because I think we are all looking forward to hearing from our galaxy of experts about why is the TRIPS waiver really necessary when there are provisions like compulsory licensing, which you have already mentioned as the foremost question, as number 1 question. The second aspect of why it is taking so much of time and whether it is going to really come through is a $1 million question. I was watching a television program yesterday, and of course the information carried in that program may not be very correct, but it said that the European Union, the UK and Switzerland, they are still very unclear as to whether they will like to plunge into a text-based negotiation at the WTO for a TRIPS waiver. And of course, a figure of $44 million was also mentioned in the course of the presentation, that this is the sum which was spent by lobbyists just in Brussels in 2020. So this is, and another figure which is of interest, which may or may not again be true, is that the lobbyists met EU officials 144 times since last July. And the pro-waiver group managed to get only one meeting with EU officials to press home their point. So this is the kind of problem that I think we are going to come up again in the WTO negotiations as well. First of all, there would be this, from my perspective, there would be this first hump to be crossed about the countries agreeing to have not only a discussion which has been going on, in the WTO and outside it since October, when the first proposal of India, South Africa, and the other countries had been tabled, but it is whether they want to go on to the next step and how long will it take for text-based negotiations to start. And that is going to be the acid test. If the countries which are opposed to this proposal, they shoot it down and they exercise their veto in the WTO not to allow a text-based negotiation, then I think it will be very difficult to pick up the pieces and to have an outcome in the near future. So that is the first one. The point that you have raised about how is it going to help? Now, as far as the point that President Biden had made is concerned, he had very specifically mentioned only vaccines. And we all know that vaccines, of course, are extremely important to control the pandemic, to bring down the numbers. But what about medicines? What about diagnostic kits? What about the other parts of medical technology like equipment, ventilators, for instance, or all the host of other equipments which are required? And many of them are also under protection, IPR protection in their respective jurisdictions, maybe software, maybe industrial design, trade secrets, and other things. So it is of the essence that the fifth waiver proposal should not remain restricted to only vaccines, but it should get enlarged to include the whole gamut of medical technology and concerning trips. So this is the second hump that will have to be crossed. And the third one, which of course is still there, and that will need to be again tackled, is about the financing aspect, which you have raised as one of the questions about ramping up production capacities. So how does the global south get access to vaccines and medical technology and the medicines, diagnostic kits, etc., all in one go? And of the essence in this context is the time which is going to be taken. If we get involved in a very long drawn out battle of attrition, as usually takes place in the WTO, especially when big pharma is involved, it is not going to be of any use, because the pandemic is not only at our door, it has entered our homes, it is ravaging countries, it's taking a huge toll. So this is the time when we need it. So if we don't get it within the next few months, latest by, and I'm making a very wild guess, latest by the ministerial, which again may be too late, is slated for December in Geneva, then I think we would have missed the bus. And the world as a whole would have missed the bus in showing solidarity with the citizens, and it would have dealt a very big blow to the continuance, as we see, of the WTO as a multilateral, truly multilateral forum, which helps not only the patent right holders, the TRIPS right holders, but also humanity at large, and it maintains a balance between the rights of these two distinct groups. And this is where I think the test for the WTO's continuance as a forum, which is worth preserving and nurturing and taking forward, will come into force. So this is goes much beyond the TRIPS waiver issue, but I think this also has to be borne in mind, and we hope that good sense will prevail. And as has happened in the past on some occasions at least, that when the US takes the lead and takes the leadership, the other countries of the West, they also, on many an occasion, have followed suit and have slowly given up their objections one by one. But this is a very complex issue, and one of the things this is the last point that I wanted to make, is that the companies, big pharma companies, which are the main opponents of the TRIPS waiver, and which are backing their governments to shoot it down in the WTO, they are also concerned about the long-term implications, if I may say, of liberalizing the production of vaccines in the short term, because mRNA technology, from what I have learned, was being developed for the past decade or longer, basically for anti-cancer treatment. So they are concerned, and this concern will also have to be addressed by all the countries, perhaps not to the full satisfaction of the pharma companies, that mRNA technology, which may also be subject to TRIPS waiver, which if there is a waiver for vaccines, it will definitely be, that it would not get misutilized or reverse engineered in a sense for making anti-cancer drugs by riding on the shoulders of the research that has already been put in by the big pharma companies in the past decade or so. So these are some of the questions that come to my mind, and I would be looking forward to listening to the presentations of the 5 very distinguished speakers for today. Without further ado, I would request Professor Correa, and just a few words of introduction. Not that Professor Correa needs any introduction in the field of intellectual property rights and innovation. He is the executive director of the South Center. He's been a prolific writer on intellectual property issues. He's been an advisor to the UN and national government, and he's also been a member of the Commission on Intellectual Property and Development. So without further ado, the first speaker for today, Professor Correa. Professor Correa.
Ambassador Dasgupta, Ambassador Carim, Sachin, distinguished speakers, participants. It's a real pleasure for the South Center to sponsor this meeting with RIS. As you know, IRS is perhaps one of the most important think tanks in the South and in developing countries. So I'm very happy to have a continuous collaboration with RIS and Professor Sachin in particular. So I would like to address the questions that were raised by Sachin. They are very relevant. And let me start by the first one on whether compulsory license is the option and whether there is a need for a waiver or not. In fact, compulsory license is a very important TRIPS flexibility. So the request for the waiver does not diminish the relevance of keeping compulsory license as an important tool for developing countries to use in case of emergencies like this one and other cases. But the very reason why compulsory license today are important but may not be sufficient include a number of things. The first one is that, as it was mentioned by Professor Chaturvedi, in the production of vaccines, there are many components. So there are many patents around vaccines. For instance, the WIPO made a study some years ago about patents related to vaccines, and they found 11,800 families of patents related to vaccines, because not only the vaccines as such may be patented, but many of the components of the vaccines may be subject to patent protection. So one problem then for the compulsory license system, as we know it today, is that there might be a need to identify all patents that may relate to the production of a particular vaccine. And as we know, in the field of pharmaceutical, this is often a complicated situation. Secondly, in the case of patents, as you may also know, when a patent application is filed, it's kept secret for at least 18 months. Therefore, there may be a situation in which a patent has not been granted yet, but while an investment is made in a developing country in order to produce a particular vaccine, perhaps a patent has been filed, and when this patent now is published, and then there may be rights that are attributed to even the patent applicant. This is the case under many national laws. And if finally the patent is granted, then this patent may be used in order to stop production which has been eventually initiated. So that's a second problem. The third one is that compulsory license under the TRIPS agreement, and in particular under Article 31, paragraph F, indicates that a compulsory license can be granted in order to supply predominantly the domestic market. And then this is an obstacle if there is a need to supply foreign markets. In the case of vaccine production, economies of scale are important. And therefore, if an investment is made, this restriction may apply. Of course, this will not apply in the case of Article 31 bis. One of the main purposes of this new article in the TRIPS agreement is to weigh precisely paragraph F of Article 31. But Article 31 bis brings another problem, and this is the basic problem is that it contains a number of very cumbersome conditions to be applied in order for a compulsory license to be used in order to provide medicines under the system which is put in place under this article. So compulsory license may be used, but they may also require time in order for the compulsory license to be granted. And all this is playing against a situation in which urgency, as it was mentioned by Ambassador Dasgupta, is of essence. So time is of essence in this situation, and therefore the waiver is looking at a more global solution. In addition, if compulsory licenses are granted, since patents are territorial, compulsory licenses are territorial as well, and therefore it might not be possible to coordinate how these compulsory licenses are granted and how they are used. So the waiver is aiming at a solution which will bring more coordination, will bring a more straightforward solution, in particular by giving some legal certainty that there will be no complaints or retaliations in case some governments decide not to enforce, for instance, particular patents that may relate to not only vaccine, it was correctly mentioned by Ambassador Dasgupta, but also to treatment or maybe diagnostic kits which are necessary in order to prevent the pandemic. Interestingly, yesterday, the European Commission did produce a paper indicating that they were in favor of facilitating the use of compulsory license, in particular in the context of Article 31 bis. So this is an implicit refusal to work on the waiver and perhaps even to start text-based negotiations on the waiver. I would say that this proposal by the European Commission is very weak and will not provide a solution. In the first place, they are arguing that it might be possible to make an interpretation of Article 31 bis in order to consider that a pandemic like the COVID-19 pandemic is an emergency, and therefore there will be no need for a prior negotiation with the right holder. Secondly, they are saying that there might be an interpretation in relation to remuneration, in order to apply remuneration, which is related to the price of the product produced under compulsory license, which was never negated under the current provision. So this will not be an improvement in any way. And thirdly, they are saying that instead of just indicating one country, when a compulsory license is granted, a list of countries to which exports could take place may be included. But this will not solve a basic problem of Article 31bis, and this is that there are so many other conditions which are imposed. For instance, the fact that there is a need to indicate what is the quantity of products to be produced specifically. And also there is a need to differentiate the product to be produced under compulsory license with the products of the originator company or the right holder. So Article 31bis is not the solution. I would say even more, I would say that moreover that this may be a good opportunity to start the revision of Article 31bis, because it's so cumbersome. It was subject to so many conditions because of, as you may recall, in the negotiation, the 90 states put a number of conditions to accept the idea of expanding the use of compulsory license. That is not workable. It has only been used in one case, as you know, between Canada and Rwanda, has never been used again. And this is not the right instrument in order to address a situation like this. I've also referred to another question made by Sachin, and this is whether a waiver may address the problem that technologies may be quite complex, and that there is also a need to get access to a number of inputs. Complexity of technology is there, so vaccines production is complex, but it's not impossible. Clearly, India, for instance, is a good example, and it has a great capacity in the production of vaccines. And this is also the case of other developing countries. My own country, Argentina, there is production of vaccines. Also Brazil has a large capacity for vaccine production. Cuba is another example. So this complexity issue should not be exaggerated. There is capacity in developing countries to produce vaccines. In many cases, the production of traditional vaccines can be engaged. Some plants which produce biologicals can be repurposed in order to produce vaccines. This is not so difficult. So the technical difficulty is not as significant as it is claimed. In relation to the messenger RNA technology, there is also this narrative that this is so complex, impossible for the countries in the south to start production in this area. Interestingly, there are already 3 vaccines based on this platform, the messenger RNA technology, which are started to be developed in developing countries, in China, in India, also in Thailand. This technology, as was mentioned by Ambassador Dasgupta, is not as new as it is assumed. It was developed, in fact, by university, the Pennsylvania University. And there the technology which is used in order for the administration of the vaccine, which is using a nanoparticle peptide, was developed by another university, the University of British Columbia. So interestingly, the basic input for development of this platform has not come from the private sector, and therefore this argument about the need to ensure intellectual property in order to produce innovation does not really apply, but these innovations came from research institutions. Therefore, it will not be impossible for the southern countries to increase production of vaccines if the conditions are met, in particular if legal certainty is ensured through a waiver. Of course, the waiver will not be sufficient. The waiver is the necessary condition in order to expand production. But as was also mentioned, suggested one of the questions by Sachin, there is a need of investment, of skills, but these do exist. It was interesting, and I think it is, of course, necessary to welcome this 50 billion support that the World Bank and IMF and the World Organization indicated a few days ago. But this unfortunately has been pledged for the purchase of vaccines. it will be important to provide financing for the manufacture of vaccines, for expanding the manufacture of vaccines in developing countries. So although this has been a welcome news, I think this has not been sufficient in terms of increasing the capacity to produce vaccines. Certainly the current inequality in the access to vaccines is because of the shortage in the supply. And then the main objective for the international community should have been from the very beginning to expand the manufacturing capacity, not just to wait for the Western companies that have been able to develop the vaccines to increase their capacity, but just to take the measures from the very beginning in order to ensure that this capacity is expanded around the world, including in developing countries. So these are just some initial comments. Again, it's a pleasure for the South Center to participate in this activity and this series of seminars. Of course, there are many questions that are important, and I hope that in the course of this seminars we will address Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Correa. That was indeed very, very insightful, and it covered a lot of ground. Just to add from what I have read, Bolivia had asked for compulsory license to be issued by Canada for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine a few months ago under Article 31 bis, but it is still unresolved, and the vaccine flow has not started because there are legal hurdles which are being sought to be overcome. That is one thing. The second point, very important point which you made about messenger RNA. In India, we have one company, Biological E, which has already been given an order to supply 300 million doses of vaccines by the end of this year. And based on mRNA technology from a Canadian patent holder. And the second one is another company called Geneva, a little known company in India, which is also very advanced now in its endeavor to produce an mRNA vaccine. So it is not something which developing countries or the South-based companies can't do. The main problem, as Sachin had mentioned, is about the stranglehold on the components and the key starting materials or the other raw materials. If those things don't flow seamlessly, then even though we have the capacity to produce, we have somehow got the, developed the technology, we will not be able to exploit it. So that is another big question which probably the global community will need to answer. I would now request, I think my friend Ambassador Xavier Carim is there. Are you there, Xavier? We can't see you.
I am here, Ambassador Gupta.
Yeah, welcome and a very good afternoon to you. Can you switch on your video, please, if possible?
My video seems to be on. I'm not sure, maybe it's not showing on your side.
Okay, so you are the next on the list of speakers.
Well, thank you very much, and it's really good to see you after a long time, Ambassador Dasgupta. And it's good to see my old friend and colleague Carlos Correa, and also thank you very much to Professor Sachin for the invitation to join this discussion today. It's really a pleasure to join you. I apologize, I mistimed I didn't get the time difference right. I forgot about the half an hour in India, and so I thought I still had another half an hour before I joined, and then I was in a bit of a rush to try to join. But really, I'm really very happy to be here, and also greetings to all the other colleagues on the panel, the other speakers today.
Thank you, Xavier. May I just take a moment to introduce you to the people who have logged in to our program. Ambassador Xavier Carim is currently Deputy Director General of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, National Government of South Africa. Ambassador Carim is a very well-known figure in Geneva in the WTO, where he was a very successful ambassador of South Africa to the WTO. He has rich experience in trade policy, international negotiations, and competition policy. And very importantly, he has seen the negotiating process from very close quarters. He has been chairman of the dispute settlement body of the WTO and also of the apex body, the General Council of the WTO. So without further ado, Ambassador Xavier Carim, my dear friend, your presentation, please.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for the introduction, Ambassador Dasgupta. I don't have a presentation, and the presentation that I did put, the sort of words I put together for this meeting, touch on some of the questions that Sachin had raised at the beginning. So I'm going to try to combine what I wanted to say and respond to the questions that have been posed. But I think Carlos has already given us an extremely insightful and comprehensive answers to some of the questions already. Just let me just give an overview of the way that we're thinking about this in South Africa. And it is an issue in South Africa that has really taken the public interest. Our president has repeatedly over the last 2 weeks said in a number of statements, raised the importance of this waiver. There was a state meeting, a state visit by Macron last week, Friday. And the talk from the president was really very, very strong in favor of continuing to push the waiver. In fact, what he said at one point is that this is a strong commitment from South Africa together with the African Union, with India, with many other developing countries. And it's an objective from which we will not retreat. I mean, I found the words quite stirring when I heard him say that we're going to continue to push for this. And I think we have to also always remember that we have enormous support for the waiver, despite the opposition from big countries. We've got over 100 members that have indicated their support. The fact that the US has come on to give its support, even with the qualification that they want the waiver to be focused on vaccines only, are important signals that this has enormous support in the WTO and around the world. So let's not lose sight of that kind of strategic direction that is being articulated. There is a lot of support to it. But I think as Carlos Correa was indicating, it's a necessary, but it's an insufficient objective. It is targeted at removing, the way we understand it, at removing the legal impediments at the multilateral level to the possibility of technology sharing and know-how sharing. So it doesn't make it happen, but it removes the legal constraints in that respect. It's also, I think, it's a proposal that is focused on trying to address what we see as the fundamental constraint at the moment now to addressing the crisis, and that is insufficient production. So anything that impedes our ability to ramp up production, bring on idle production that is available, and it's been Carlos has already raised that there is capacity in many developing countries, and in South Africa we've heard our companies say that the two issues that constrain them from moving more decisively in this direction. One is the access to the technology and the associated know-how. And second, they need advanced market commitments. They need to know that if they produce, and they're producing for Africa or they're producing for COVAX, a certain percentage, that gives them the business case to boost capacity. The fact that we have, I mean, it seems to me, this is almost an unlimited global market. And it's going to be a market that needs to be serviced for some time with possible mutations. I mean, for as long as the pandemic is rolled out, booster shots that will be needed in future. This is just a massive undertaking. And of course, we have to also bear in mind that we are not only thinking about this pandemic, but we're thinking of the possibility of pandemics in the future that we need to start to prepare for. So the proposal that we see it is a production focused object. It has a production upscaling production as the focus of its its intent. Now, of course, it requires a number of other things. And as I said, I mean, when I was speaking to our private sector, they were not so worried about finance or investment. They believed if they had the technology, they had the advanced market commitments, the finance would be forthcoming. They would be able to leverage finance to support that investment. So that is the way that we've understood that. You know, as I was thinking about this meeting, I started thinking back to this, and one of the key observations, and I think this is at the heart of the debate and the discussion and the contestation in the WTO and globally. And this observation is that, you know, over the last 25 years, we've seen the emergence and consolidation of a global arrangement in which the centers for cutting edge research and development, for innovation, and for know-how in respect to the knowledge, production, and distribution of medicines is highly concentrated amongst a few companies, big pharmaceutical companies, located primarily in a handful of countries. And when we think about how did this happen, there are basically two issues. It's been a combination of of relatively open markets. We've had to all open our markets over time across a whole range of things, but combined with this very strong instrument of the TRIPS agreement and the powerful protection that it provides for patents. And that's at the heart of the debate. And when we look back at the last 20 years, there's always been a tension between what is perceived as a regime where the production of medicines and now vaccines are driven primarily by market and commercial interests, as opposed to the view that public health needs to be given the primacy. So we had the debate. I mean, this has been a tension for a long time. This came to the fore that eventually during the HIV and AIDS pandemic. We have the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and public health. That was the first indication that's where this tension arose. But I think what the current global pandemic has shown is this overall arrangement is inadequate in order to, and insufficient to respond to the kind of challenges that we're facing now. A comment just on the compulsory licensing. I mean, I agree completely with Professor Correa on that. The fact of the matter is that the compulsory licensing and the decision was taken without the notion of a global pandemic. However, I think when we look at what the European Union is saying now in the proposal that came out yesterday, the question for me that arises is to what extent that proposal will move towards waiving all the conditions that are attached in the decision, in the amendment to Article 31 bis. I mean, those conditions are quite onerous. But if the idea behind that, and this is what we need to explore, is to what extent those conditions will be waived. If it's limited and it doesn't deal with it, then it's too weak. But there could be something in there if it's a waiver of all of those conditions attached to it, or an easing of those conditions. The other thing I thought is maybe just I'll try to conclude now, but just with 3 questions that I wanted to pose. We've only seen the EU proposal. We got an early view of it a couple of weeks ago, but didn't pay much attention to it because we wanted to see what it looks like finally. But there are a number of key things that I think that we need to focus on in today and maybe in the discussions going forward. The essential thrust of the EU proposal, and of course supported by a number of other members, is to keep markets open and to keep the IP protection intact. That's the essential target of their proposal. And it starts off with the trade facilitation agenda, and it goes on to prohibiting or trying to discipline export restrictions. And that may be useful in some respect. But essentially, it's trying to preserve the current arrangements. And that's where the issues start to arise that I've mentioned. The second is the second point in that is the EU proposal says that the IP is an opportunity, not an obstacle. And the immediate thing when I read that is that doesn't tally with what over 100 countries have been saying. They're saying that there is a problem with IP and that needs to be addressed. So I'm not sure if by asserting it, they somehow dismiss the views of 100 countries that easily. I think we'll have to engage on that. The second thing is the point on the flexibilities under the compulsory licensing. And I think here, I've said it, but the question is really, to what extent will the EU and those that support them be prepared to waive the conditions attached to that? And if not, that would answer whether or not this is a valuable proposal or not, because we've been complaining for over 2 decades that since the decision came in, that those conditions are too onerous. And then the third question, and this will be my last point, is there's a great stock that is put into voluntary licensing arrangements as a way to deal with boosting capacity, production capacity in developing countries. And of course, we know this is not a new proposal. This has been available for many years. Countries have entered into these type of arrangements previously. But if this is going to be put forward as a solution to the current crisis, then we need to ask some very serious questions about those types of arrangements. We know that there's a complete lack of transparency on the terms of such arrangements. We know that many of them particularly involve contract production that focuses, and certainly in South Africa's case, has been on a fill and finish. It doesn't help you move up and down the value chain and also give you rights for distribution, which is quite important for scale, for economies of scale. The negotiations are not transparent. The fact that there are high costs attached to technology transfer, we don't know what different companies end up paying for the technology. The limitations on production that can go along with that, the limitations on distribution that can go along with that. Those are all issues that if this is going to be put forward as a possible solution, we need much more transparency and maybe some standards in how they'll be effected on that. Now, maybe just an absolute last point for now is, I mean, I think this is goes to the point that you've mentioned, Ambassador Dasgupta, and it's about the timing. These are all complex questions, and they will require some further engagement. And what we've been quite focused on is trying to get countries to that negotiating table as soon as possible, so we could start to hammer out how we deal with these. But so far, the debate has been a bit removed. So more and more focus on trying to get countries into the negotiating room to start to hammer some of these out, I think is going to be critical. Let me stop there. And again, thanks very much for the opportunity to make an input into today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Carim, for your very valuable input and insights into the whole process. And I share the thoughts that you have shared about Article 31 bis, which Professor Correa also mentioned, being extremely cumbersome. And the whole problem is about compulsory licensing not really meeting the need of the hour unless the investors, the people who ramp up their production, are rid of the fear of legal challenges. So the issue of TRIPS waiver is basically about not getting bogged down by unnecessary legal challenges in the countries where compulsory licenses are issued and in the WTO. So that is one issue. The second point is about voluntary licensing, and there is a lot of literature which has shown that the conditions that the patent holders impose on the licensees are extremely onerous, very restrictive. The amount of production that they can have, where they can sell it, whether they can export it, all kinds of problems are there. And again, the kind of profit sharing. And the point that you have mentioned is about fill and finish. Unless you transfer technology to manufacture, if it is going to come in bulk and you just put it in some small bottles and do the filling and finishing, then the technology transfer is not taking place at all. And it is extremely inequitable. So all these issues will have to be tackled. And I think I must mention the initiative taken a few weeks ago by the new Director General of the WTO. He had appealed to the G7 leaders, saying that you must take the process into your own hands and direct your negotiators and key personnel to hammer out an agreement, because it is not only important to have some kind of a text, of course, based negotiation. It is extremely important to have a meeting of the heart, because the meeting of minds in agreeing to some language is not going to fit the bill and provide a solution to this problem. I would now request the next speaker. He's a very distinguished professor, Professor Graham Dutfield of Leeds University, who has written widely on access to medicines, biodiversity, and traditional knowledge, besides authoring textbooks on different aspects of IP law. His most recent work is a history of the pharmaceutical industry called That High Design of Purest Gold, a critical history of the pharmaceutical industry, 1880 to 2020. It is indeed, I would say, kind of a reference book, a magnum opus in the area of pharmaceuticals. So a very warm welcome to Professor Dutfield. I hope I am pronouncing your name correctly.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you. And please take the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I want to thank also Sachin and Ravi for inviting me. And I'm surrounded by people who probably know more than I do about this particular issue. In fact, I know that's true. And as also I have to sort of try and contribute in a way that hasn't been already been done by the ambassador and also by Professor Correa, and see how I can contribute here. So, okay, so let me actually do something which you might not expect, which is to start off with what industry actually says. So I'm going to start off with what industry says. So a few, just about 3 quotes here. This is from the head of Pharma, you know, the industry association. He says, in the midst of a deadly pandemic, the Biden administration has taken an unprecedented step that will undermine our global response to the pandemic and compromise safety. Okay, so he says Biden has taken an unprecedented step. It's like it's never been done before. Okay, interesting thing to say. I'm sure you might agree. Thomas Quiney of the IFPMA says, at a time when the focus should be on science and innovation, undoing the very system that supports it is dangerous and counterintuitive. Well, that sounds almost, if I dare say, almost hysterical, right? But of course, this particular sort of mantra, this reaction, is something that lots of countries have really bought into, you know. So, so quoting the Canadian scholar Richard Gold, he says that the assumption that IP rights generally and patent rights in particular are crucial, if not absolutely necessary, to foster innovation is deeply ingrained in governmental policy making and judicial reasoning in many countries. And of course, that is quite a large part of the reason why, you know, the UK, the EU, Switzerland, with its very large pharmaceutical industry for a small country, has really bought into this idea. Okay, now, of course, what is being asked for here is essentially a temporary suspension of TRIPS obligations. That's what it really is. In my view, it's quite a modest request. It's actually a very modest request. These obligations didn't exist before 1995. They did not exist. So facing a crisis, countries will be given freedom to do what they think is necessary to for the good of the country and the population. And of course, although patents are not everything here, it's interesting to be reminded that in the 60s and 70s, most European countries only started to introduce patents for drugs. Switzerland, 1978, Germany, 1968. The UK stopped allowing patents on medicines between 1919 and 1949. So there's a history here of doing as we please, or what we think is right, without being constrained by these rather strict global norms. And then, in fact, it's been known by economists, you know, going back to Josef Schumpeter, the Austrian economist, who would say actually patents and innovation are 2 completely separate things. The relationship between monopoly and innovation, again, is largely unproven. So this is, in a sense, an argument from industry that is not really evidence-based. Some people talk about faith-based policymaking, as if it's a sort of religion that doesn't require investigation scientifically. But actually, it is, in a sense, you know, we are being told to assume that without patents and IP rights, there'd be no innovation. And this is the onus should be on those people saying this to, well, prove it to us, because quite a lot of the anti-waiver reactions that I've seen, apart from coming from industry, come from people who say, well, you guys don't know anything about IP, you don't know anything about how industry works. It's very patronizing, and I have to say rather arrogant. But actually, when I see the expertise among the people who are supporting the waiver, I actually think the bulk of the expertise, the objective, unbiased expertise, is on the side of the pro-waiver people. That's just an opinion that I have, but I think it's largely and likely true. Okay, so last week I gave a talk at Tufio Cruz in Brazil, which is making the AstraZeneca vaccine, and which was a bit of a high pressure one, that was, because I thought I need to really prepare for this one and do it properly, and I was speaking for about an hour. But while I was preparing for that, I came up with what I thought were 4 quite useful basic principles to go by in a global pandemic situation. Now, the first 2 perhaps are rather obvious. I said principle 1: every person's life counts. That's that's obvious to me, but it's not obvious what policy should be based on that principle. And industry would say it too. Their industry would say, yeah, we agree every person's life counts. So that's one that in itself is not sufficient. The next principle is every day counts. So a necessary decision made tomorrow that could have been made today means more lives lost, and more diminished livelihoods, more economic devastation, and reduced delivery of other health interventions, especially for the poor, and increased possibility of more infective variants. Principle 3 is that international cooperation is essential and must be based on sharing of medical technologies and the means to produce and supply them, and that should be done universally and equitably. And then principle 4, I wrote this down. I said it is reasonable, if not necessary, to restrain artificial scarcities arising from nationalist policies, or from private rights, or 3, from business models that jeopardize activities embodying these principles. So the onus, in my view, should be on those countering restraints to justify themselves, because business as usual arguments that I have seen tend to be quite unconvincing. So business as usual isn't really working. Okay, so we have been here before in many ways. I study history, so where have we been? Have we been here before? And actually, we sort of have, and not that long ago. We rather have forgotten that going back a few years, of course, there was the issue of avian flu, and Indonesia refused to share samples, viral samples. And Indonesia's view was that, well, why should we share these? The WHO system isn't working in our favor because we share the viral samples. A company is going to develop vaccines which we will never be able to get because it's going to be expensive, supplied for the rich country market. We won't get that. We will be bottom of the queue. So we have actually been there before, only a few years ago. Now, in 2007, I was contacted by somebody at the World Bank, a health expert at the World Bank, and she asked me, well, is there something in the Biodiversity Convention to say that Indonesia must hand over its viral samples? Well, I wrote back and said no, but then we had a bit of a dialogue, and I said, well, it might be regrettable, unfortunate that Indonesia is doing this, but it is totally within its rights. And this might be an opportunity for the World Bank to support some kind of dialogue, so that, and part of the deal should be that, given that vaccines are going to go to the rich world first, what should be part of the discussion should be technology transfer. That should be part of the discussion. I'm not saying that my email had any effect at all. I really have no idea. But I did say the World Bank could maybe usefully contribute by supporting international dialogue, so that the complaints of Indonesia could be heard. Now, of course, in a sense, Indonesia had a bit of a bargaining position because they could withhold the viral samples. And of course, the principle they're arguing for was benefit sharing. Benefit sharing. So we need benefit sharing. So we need access to vaccines. That's a benefit. And another benefit, would be sharing of technology. Now, technology transfer has been on the agenda of the United Nations since the early 1960s. You see technology transfer in the Biodiversity Convention, you see it in the Climate Change Convention, you see it in the Montreal Protocol, etc., etc., etc. It's there in TRIPS. It is an unkept promise. It's a promise that the rich countries have made, and they don't take it seriously. And that's disgraceful, right? We say, oh, you have to allow these things to be patentable, etc., etc., but we're not going to share the technology. And that is, it is an unkept promise. Now, when you look at what was settled with the World Health Organization with the avian flu, you have this pandemic preparedness framework, which makes quite explicit reference to technology transfer, including know-how. So in a sense, much of it is actually there. So we have been here before. Why do we have to go through it all over again and again and again when nothing seems to happen? Nothing seems to change. So that's why I think that the waiver proposed is actually a very modest request. It's asking for, in the wider scheme of things, not that much. The industry will still get its delivery of shareholder value. It will still make large amounts of profit. And in addition to which, this is something I was preparing for my Fiocruz talk, I came across this World Bank report where they actually estimated how much the scale of the global economic destruction, the cost of COVID being unchecked, how much it costs. And it doesn't just cost, it's the global economy. So wherever you are in the world, you are going to be affected by this. And they estimated that, and of course these figures are, I can't vouch for them, but they argue that it would be economically rational to pay whatever it needs to be spent to scale up vaccine delivery to the whole world. And of course, that amount of money is, that upfront cost is far less than the cost to the world economy of actually doing nothing. So however that technology is transferred, whether it is voluntary or whether it's paid for by those countries who can afford to pay, it is economically rational to actually make this happen. It's good for all of us. It is good for the global economy. So we do need to do it. The details of how, of course, that's going to be an ongoing discussion, how that's done. But I note the comments of earlier speakers that this. It's not alchemy. It's not turning base metal into gold, which we know can't really be done. It's not splitting the atom. It's not sending a rocket to Mars. Yes, it's complex. These technologies are complex. And of course, the problem with complex technologies is that you have lots of IP around them. We sort of know this, which is why biologic drugs have so many patents around them. So complex technologies have complex IP landscapes, which is of course why compulsory licensing is going to get you there incredibly slowly, license by license, patent by patent. That's just not going to do it, is it? So so we need to have the waiver, so you cut across every single compulsory licensing negotiation. That's going to take forever, because we need this to be done, every day. And as I say, a decision made tomorrow that could have been made today, that's more infected people, more possibilities of the virus, of the new variant coming, running amok, more financial losses for that country and for the global economy. So yeah, I think at that point I'm going to stop. But hopefully I managed to say a few things that that Carlos and the ambassador hadn't said that might be of some use. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to give my 5 minutes worth, 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dutfield, for parsing the arguments put forward by the industry, the big pharma lobby, about why it is going to be difficult for the developing countries, because the safety standards, etc., may not be adhered to in the developing countries. That is the sort of argument which one has been hearing all these years. And as far as technology transfer is concerned, I agree 100% with you that this has been one of the major unfulfilled promises of various agreements. Just as an aside, I remember in the 2012 UNTAD meeting held in Qatar, I was there, and we had a whole night discussion on whether technology transfer should be put in an UNTAD document. And the US, if I may mention the country by name, said it is between a private company which owns an intellectual property and somebody else which buys it. It could be a government, it could be another company. So why do you want to involve two nations into this and make a binding commitment of this? So this is just the kind of retreat that has been taking place. And mind you, this is of 2012, 9 years ago. So technology transfer, the governments in the developed countries, which are also under a lot of pressure from the industry, because in many countries they are extremely important contributors to campaign funds, etc. One understands that. They are, I think, taking the stand that they will be hands-off. Technology transfer, governments don't have a role to play, especially when it is from the perspective of a country which is the giver. There are several very important points that you have made, Professor, but I think what I will carry from what you have mentioned, extremely important point, is that the proposal is extremely modest. And the dates that you mentioned, Britain 1949 and Canada, I think it's still about 1990 or something, they had this absolute freedom that they could have a process patent as we had till 2005, till not so long ago. And that is what led to the development of the pharmaceutical industry in the respective countries. So people are suddenly forgetting all the past history about how they developed their pharmaceutical industry, developed self-reliance, and how they tackled public health issues. And this is, I think, something which one needs to remind the negotiators once again when they get together in Geneva. I now have Dr. Thambisetty, Associate Professor, London School of Economics, who's an expert on IP law, specializing on patents, and has written extensively on various aspects of patent law. He has done research on access and benefit sharing, and is currently researching on digital sequence information and access and benefit sharing. Dr. Thambisetty, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you also to my panelists for making my job slightly easier and also slightly more difficult. So I've been given about 10 to 12 minutes, and I have 5 points I want to make. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, so apologies if I'm going a bit too fast. I'm happy to take questions. I'm particularly grateful, before I continue, particularly grateful to Graham for laying out some of the premise in our recently published paper. I would encourage those in the audience who haven't accessed it yet to download it from SSRN. And Professor Chaturvedi, we address many of the 5 questions in great detail in that paper. In my next 10 minutes, I don't want to go into the details of the paper. I'm going to assume that that paper is read. And I want to touch upon different ways of framing the problem that we're discussing today. So in my experience of observing some international negotiations related to IP, there are 2 occasions when everything gets put on the table. One is when there are new norms that are set up, and the other when there's an exceptional situation that requires these norms to be interpreted, moderated, or supplemented. And because this is one such case, I think the question of whether the TRIPS agreement has failed in the first place ought to be on the table. So what's the problem we're talking about here? Just very briefly, COVAX has given 76 million doses. Biden promised a couple of days ago 19 million extra doses, which, given the 76 million, seems like a lot, but it's still a drop in the ocean for the 11 billion doses we actually need. 200 to 300 million doses are being hoarded by wealthy countries. And most worryingly, about 1.5 billion doses have been purchased in advance. Now, it's not just that these doses won't be available for poorer countries, it's also that productive capacity that could go into producing first doses are now going to go into producing booster doses for wealthy countries. So this sort of trickle-down process of access to medicines and vaccines, I think we can agree, hasn't really worked. And there comes a point in time when we need to stop pulling the people falling into the river downstream and swim upstream to find out what the problem is, right? And I'm sure, as Leena will tell us, inequity of access is not new. We've been fighting for this for a number of years. But I think what is galling in this current context is that the severity of the crisis has not moved others to act with urgency. The second point about why I think the TRIPS agreement's failure has to be on the table is the technology gap that Ambassador Carim so eloquently put out. And I want to remind ourselves here that developing productive capacity now with urgency is not the end of the story. It's not a passive process, right? Because over time, we expect this productive capacity to lead to innovative capacity. And therefore, it's incredibly important that this moment in time is a time when these kinds of changes can happen. Now, why have we not seen the technology gap reduce? So global IP rules create roving capital, not stationary capital. Combined with the autonomy of local IP holders, you can't really control where that capital goes. So the Serum Institute's founder was able to recently announce a 240 million investment in the UK in the science and technology related to vaccine production. So you can't control that kind of movement of capital given global IP rules. So the whole structure of the TRIPS agreement, I think, is something that we need to be talking about. My second point is about the nature of the waiver. And I think this is important for us to get our heads around it because it will make a difference to what goes into the text of the waiver. We know that patent disclosure itself is insufficient. And we know, in fact, a previous version of the EU's report, which was leaked by Knowledge Exchange International, goes into this in much more detail than the current version. And we need expertise, we need tacit, informal know-how, we need access to trade secrets, we need access to regulatory information that might be protected as exclusive information. So in this context, let's look at where the moral weight of the waiver is coming from, right? Now, if you omit to act, more people will die. But that's not clearly the same as saying or taking action that causes people to die. But in the case of a pandemic, when you might be sitting on exclusive or secret information, doing nothing is a way of doing something. And I would say not doing enough is also a way of doing something. Therefore, focusing on COVAX, for instance, is a way of doing something towards allowing those more deaths to happen. So moving from the ethical to the normative, in the paper, we describe the waiver as an incentive and a mandate. What do we mean by this? So the mandate alone is not going to work, right? Because there is no route to compelling disclosure by foreign IP holders. There's no route for us to make that happen. Therefore, we will need incentives to flow from governments, either through voluntary measures, things like buyouts, etc. Now, these measures could be external to the waiver, or they may be represented in some form in the waiver. So I think this dual carrot and stick nature of the waiver is really important. And it also makes this moment in time between now and when the text is finalized very fertile, because there's a lot of pressure to get these kinds of voluntary agreements in place. I'll come to the text in a minute, but I also want to say that the waiver is also a political measure, right? It also is going to lead to a number of political levers playing out. We saw with the Doha Agreement, for instance, there was newfound cooperation from African countries at the WTO. It was generally seen as a success of the multilateral process. There was renewed energy for the Doha development round. So we can expect discussions on the waiver, post-waiver, to also lead to certain movements in the WTO. And I think that's something worth watching for and perhaps also instigating. My final point in terms of how to think about the waiver is something that I think we miss out on very often when we talk about Article 31 bis, which is Doha virtually rewrote the TRIPS agreement, right? Because it incorporated implicitly the right to exclude exports as one of the rights that a patent holder has. And this was the case even though there was no mention of it in Article 28.1, and none of the major economies at that time had this version of export being a part of the rights of the patent holder. And this was because of the strict territoriality of IP. So the assumption that we can separate what happens in domestic and foreign markets. There's also a negative of this to the patent holder, which is conditions of public health and social conditions in other countries could be taken into account in how IP was enforced domestically. Now, I think this is really important to recognize because Doha essentially amplified this extraterritorial nature of domestic IP enforcement. And I think the same will happen with the waiver. Now, I don't know exactly what direction it will take, but I can speculate. So for instance, it enhances the relevance of facts and events that occur abroad when you assess intellectual property protection at home, domestically. Perhaps it could lead to a rethink of the IP competition law and public health triangle, because as we know, with the TRIPS agreement, competition policy was left to domestic measures, but if perhaps this could revitalize Article 8.2. So I would like to think about technology transfer in the context of domestic IP and competition policy as being a sort of triangulation that can emerge through the discussions we have around the waiver. So my third point, I just have another one, but I will just say this, that, between what 25 years ago and now, a lot has happened in terms of competition policy. For instance, the European Commission is paying a great deal of attention to anti-competitive practices in EU member states. And in a current context, maybe you might have come across this case of Roche refusing to disclose the buffer recipe, which was having a huge impact in how testing is carried out. So, the Dutch ability to test depending on the buffer recipe being made available. Now, Roche then put out a recipe last year, which was not the actual recipe that was being used. And the EC has now said that it's keeping an eye on this, and Roche has said they will share the recipe if Dutch manufacturers ask for it. Now, I think this is important because it shows the kinds of pressure that can apply in this current context, in this space between IP and competition. With respect to the text of the waiver, I don't want to say too much, but I do want to note two things, maybe three things of importance. again, I think I agree with Graham that it's modest, but what I would say is that we need much more detail in the text of the proposal. So I note the questions about restricting health products and technologies to COVID-19, the parts reference to Section 7, trade secrets, which is incredibly important. The temporal aspect, the 3 years, and the fact that the way it's currently structured could mean that it's potentially indefinite. I think that's going to be a real problem. The idea of putting more detail rather than less in a waiver proposal is that I think it's also important to give negotiating parties some easy wins, some things we can haggle on, and some aspirational goals. I think a text proposal that has all of these is more likely to have enough traction to make good progress. And I note that there's nothing, when we talk about the waiver, there's nothing being said yet about how you can address needs in third countries. So not going down Article 31 bis route, what else can we do to take note of social and public health conditions in other economies? I think that has to be somewhere in the proposal. There is also nothing in the waiver at the moment to compel countries to put in place measures to encourage disclosure of trade secrets or know-how. I think this could be a missed opportunity because the waiver, as we know, in itself is not enough. If it leads just to countries not acting, that's not going to be sufficient. We need enough in the proposal that encourages countries to take positive measures. And I don't see that language in the waiver as it is. My fourth point is what can we expect from the waiver? Just, there are others here who know the sort of legal and political mix that we're working with here. I think the main question is, do we wait until the text of the waiver is finalized? I think no. I really, I see a quickening in the ether around what's happening with vaccine production and voluntary licensing agreements at least being talked about. So I think this is a particularly fertile time to use the sort of mandate and incentive of the waiver that is going to happen to start talking about regional collaborative agreements and greater number of voluntary licensing agreements, keeping in mind, of course, that all LMICs are not homogeneous, right? We need to have different measures in place. So, but I do think this period could be quite fertile and we should push on with what can be done. I have one point here to make about sort of confusing signals that have been coming from India with respect to the use of compulsory licenses. So the government of India put out, I think it's the Ministry of Home Affairs that put out the affidavit in the Supreme Court about urging the court not to make any movement towards compulsory licenses, arguing that this could have serious, severe, and unintended adverse consequences. Now, it's not unusual for different departments in a government to have different positions on the same issue. In fact, in a lower court in Myriad, the US Department of Justice and the US Patent Office put in conflicting briefs on the same matter. But I think I'm quite puzzled by this position, and I think there should be more internal discussion so that there's greater alignment between an internal position and the external position that's being taken in the negotiations. I think this is critical. I know I'm nearly out of time, but my last and final point goes back to what Graham started with, the incentive argument. I think one thing that I've been quite surprised during the whole, and I think Graham and I have had chats about this, is how IP academics and IP scholarship has reacted to the issue. Now, some of it is about genuine incoherence in that way we justify IP. I think there are many different ways in which you can justify particular kinds of IP, some of which are freestanding, so you can pick and choose which justification you want to use. There's also disagreement about what IP is, right? Is it divinely ordained, or in jurisprudential terms, is it discovered and therefore not socially constructed or a matter of social law? And then there are those who view IP as inviolable property rights, and then those who see it as part of the regulatory state. Those who prioritize the incentive function and those who want to talk mainly about the allocative or dissemination function. So there's genuine disagreement, but I also hope that this moment in time when we're talking about the waiver can give us all pause in the kind of IP that is predominant in our international discussions on IP. It's a very muscular view of IP. It privileges private initiative over, say, good fortune or circumstance. And I think this really must become a moment where we consider whether those narratives of IP are fit for purpose when it comes to civilizational challenges, a pandemic, climate resilient technologies, global warming, our damaged oceans. These are not going to be addressed by the version of IP that we currently have. Just as a last point, it just occurred to me as I was reading the EU document closely. They mention incentives once, and it's in a very interesting context. And I think it's an inaccurate use of the term incentive. The document says intellectual property framework provides a platform that incentivizes collaboration and transfer of know-how. I think that's just plain wrong, but it's also a reflection of the ways in which there's incoherence about the way we talk about IP. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Thambisetty, for sharing your very insightful perspectives on this whole issue. And there would be many supporters of the view that you have propounded about more radical amendment to the TRIPS agreement and rethink, because there are these global issues which are looming large. It is not only this pandemic, but as you mentioned, the environmental issue and the other issues which may crop up, which would require a much more collaborative kind of an endeavor and association between innovation and private industry and the citizenry of the world. I quite take the point that you have made about incentivizing the production of vaccines, medicines, and all the other things, which would be the subject of the TRIPS waiver. In this context, there was work done under UNITAID, and Gilead, for instance, had licensed out under the aegis of the UNITAID and WHO. And I wonder whether that percentage of 3 to 5% could again be, held out as a sort of a carrot to incentivize these pharma companies. Not that it would be enough, nothing would be enough, because I think Moderna has shown initial estimates that it would gain $18 billion just this year alone from selling its vaccines, and Pfizer a very modest $15 billion. So that is the kind of figure that we are talking about. We are running a little bit short of time, but it has been an extremely interesting session. And our last speaker for this afternoon is Ms. Leena Menghaney of Médecins Sans Frontières Access Campaign. She is a prominent civil society representative on access to medicine issues. She is a trained lawyer, and she's been focusing on using TRIPS flexibility, enhancing access to medicine, and law and policy related to IP. He is actively involved in patent challenges on key drugs of major interest in public health programs of India. I would now request Ms. Menghaney to take the floor.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So I'll just put on a few slides just to sort of focus my conversation, and also just so I am short and sweet. I really enjoyed what everyone said, and it sort of added to my technical knowledge. So thank you to South Center and RIS to organize this, and of course, Jayant for hosting it. I just wanted to say a couple of things. I'm a treatment activist. Actually, my life has been spent asking governments to focus more on treatment and not just on prevention. And I feel that COVID is exactly that once again. No infectious disease has been won by just doing vaccination. And we are just starting to sort of observe that, particularly after the India wave, and now Nepal is very badly affected. You see Northeast in India very badly affected. So if we are to go forward, we've got to think about the medicines and the drugs, besides, of course, the diagnostics and of course, the vaccines. And very early on, I think the conversation about the waiver just sort of fixated on vaccines completely. And it's been a very unfortunate development that people view the waiver as a vaccine-oriented discussion. It also suits pharma to do that because they directly use that process to sort of engage in, I would say, a very colonial conversation about how people in developing countries just do not have the technical capacity to make vaccines, sort of tarring us with all the same brush, not looking at the massive developments that have happened on technology in developing countries, despite the resistance of pharma companies and other obstacles and the lack of investment by governments themselves. So we are at a point where we need to start thinking about therapeutics quite quickly. On that point, I wanted to say, it does not matter if it comes by December. We are at that point where the drugs are in early pipeline. Even if it comes by the end of December, and we have the drugs, coming out next year, and they are patent-free or IP-free, I think there are a large number of developing countries who will just go out and be able to produce them. So we need to, weigh the conversations about vaccines with also our conversations about, treatment. So that's one aspect that I wanted to clearly highlight. The other point I really wanted to sort of highlight was simply this, that, the waiver, as Professor pointed out, is a very modest proposal and should have actually been made for HIV and AIDS. As much as we think COVID is a very big pandemic today, we thought about AIDS in those terms at the time when, HIV AIDS was at its peak and people were dying in Africa, economies were affected, livelihoods were affected. And at that point of time, I think this was unfinished business. We should have been more, as I would say, we should have thought about this 20 years ago. In some sense, the reason why I say this, as Doctors Without Borders, one of our jobs as lawyers is to support the supply team. So in India, there's no problem with buying medicines, or South Africa, because of the Competition Commission decision 20 years ago, which sort of facilitated, South Africa's inclusion in all voluntary licenses for HIV/AIDS. You didn't see these problems relating to HIV/AIDS medicines and generics in India and South Africa. India because of the patent law, and South Africa because of the Competition Commission's great decision. But we also work in places like Thailand and Ukraine, upper middle income countries, not LMICs, Latin America, we are starting to, treat in Brazil and many other places. So MSF, every single time we go out to treat, we have a problem in upper middle income countries, not just in LMICs. So the voluntary licenses mechanisms that have been set up are just not fit for purpose. So either we get all countries included in voluntary licenses, but to pick and choose between people's nationalities to whether, they should be entitled to treatment, it's just purely discriminatory. So that's something that I would like to sort of highlight, that the waiver sort of addresses that quite quickly and quite efficiently. The brunt of what, for example, the MPP licenses have brought for Ukraine and other countries who have been systematically left out of these licenses. More importantly, I think India has not been analyzing the voluntary license. The threshold of the voluntary license is falling. So if RIS were to look at the latest licenses, and I'll point to the Hep C licenses, India is a purely manufacturing country, cannot use the drugs itself. Not a single manufacturer, in the absence of the domestic market, has agreed to those licenses. So licenses, even within the medicines patent pool, are failing in India themselves. So that's the second point I wanted to make about voluntary measures. Now coming down to compulsory licensing and the European Union proposal, there are 2 or 3 things that obviously, are well highlighted in the discussions we've had. One, they are meant to divide and sort of, slow down the negotiations in a way. We all know that 31 bis is not fit for purpose. We also know that we can't go country by country, product by product, trying to solve IP problems that we have done for HIV and now hepatitis C. Just does not work. So lastly, I think no matter how much money the EU pours into the COVAX now, or how much vaccines they donate, I think what we are asking for is change, not charity. So you can donate if you so want, but again, with COVID, if you look at the larger nature of what we require for testing, what the chemicals and the buffers and so on, there are many countries who could, make the raw materials for testing. Again, for treatments, many countries would be able to make the drugs. So if we are to look at a larger scale, European Union's decision that we will give more donations, more funding, and we will encourage our companies to make more for LMIC is purely such a colonial way of thinking that is absolutely unacceptable that even discussing the proposal. That's the way we see it at MSF. Lastly, as treatment providers, I think we're gearing up with huge waves coming through in developing countries. So one of the things that we clearly are noticing is that the big divide that everyone sort of talks about is that there are larger number of people being vaccinated in developed countries, while developing countries, even healthcare workers are not vaccinated. Forget about the comorbidities, vulnerable sections, and so on. And the world has waited and watched this entire system play out. And part of it, and not entirely, but part of it was fueled by the intellectual property system that concentrated the capacity to manufacture in the hands of a few countries. Coming down to India, I think, did not pay attention to the licenses. I think every time a license is signed by the Indian companies, there's a huge, as I would say, all economic papers just sort of lay out the red carpet for companies like Serum Institute and so on. What they failed to do is to look at the contractual obligations under the license. And what happened was, instead of 3 or 4, which is the rule in pharmaceuticals, we just gave the license to 1, which is Serum Institute. I would say that there were 3 actors in that. There was Oxford and of course AstraZeneca and the UK government, but there was also India. India could have very much said, let's look at the license. We want to see what's in it. And said, no, not enough to have Serum Institute. We want to add a couple of more manufacturers. We have capacity. What Carla said, that biological companies could be repurposed for vaccines, was very true even at that time. And RDIF has done that for Sputnik right now under our noses. So I think this is something, these exclusive deals, these voluntary licenses, have sort of been the voluntary actions that everyone relies upon, and then tends to, a year later or a few years later, realize they are not fit for purpose. So I just wanted to sort of highlight that the EU's proposal is something. We may want to reform the compulsory licensing mechanism, but as we know, even in India, policymakers are petrified of using compulsory licensing because it means it's not governments who might pressure them, it's pharma companies, corporations who put a lot of pressure on them and chase them and harass them about why they issued the compulsory license. We saw this in the case of Bayer when it came to the court cases it launched both against the government of India and NATCO. So it's not just about the EU being more open to compulsory licenses. Pharmaceutical corporations are not open to compulsory licensing, and they will use their lobbying clout to constantly undermining it. We need something to go over and above the clout of the pharmaceutical industry and just sort of make it a more equal playing field for all governments and manufacturers, so to speak. So that's it.
Thank you, Ms. Menghaney. This was indeed very, very enlightening. Whenever I hear Ms. Menghaney speak, I learn so much. Just one point I wanted to mention about something which you highlighted about medicines, the importance of medicines, new medicines which are being tried out, some being repurposed. There is just one medicine which has been introduced in India about a week ago by Roche. It is a combination of 2 monoclonal antibodies, and it costs about 60,000 rupees or $80. And it is just out of reach of most Indians. Now, if this TRIPS waiver were to come through, and of course, compulsory licenses we still can issue, but I entirely agree with you. It is not only the pharma companies and their enormous clout, but also small things like 301 and Super 301, which has dissuaded us from going down that path. So I think we have come to a very, very interesting and session where we have all, I think, shared and learned from each other, me most of all. I would now request, do we have time, Sachin, for questions from the floor, or should we?
Yeah, we are already far above the time that we thought of, almost 25 minutes. But I would request you, maybe if you can just go around the table with one or two questions, because the chat box and the Q&A is full with questions and observations. So whatever you want to pick up, Chair.
No, I think, Sachin, I think please take on the responsibility. Just pick up a few questions from the chat box and ask one of the experts to answer those questions, please.
So let me just see, and I would also request all the panelists to have a look at Q&A and chat box. I know Graham has been following discussion in the chat box. So if any of you have already picked up some question that you can respond to, and I know Dr. Siva did respond while speaking to some of the points already in the chat box. So I think the burden is lesser to that point. But given the kind of huge interest that this seminar today has attracted from various parts of the world, and some people really getting up pretty early from the Pacific. So I think the panel, if they can quickly help us pick up, let me see this myself as well. 3 points that I could capture very well and appreciated is in terms of what kind of judicial review, if we go for compulsory licensing, is called for. So what would be the sort of appropriate duration for exemption if we at all go for? And second is about the technologies, which Carlos referred to in the beginning. But voluntary licenses came up by Ambassador Carim, and I think that limitation has also appeared in the discussion. The third dimension that I found quite interesting is in terms of genetic sort of manipulation, and I think the question is more about mRNA technology, and that goes to Chair, who himself mentioned that 3 countries have come up, and then later we heard Carlos explaining what all countries are. So how are these trends of China, Thailand, and India in specific terms to have their vaccines based on this? Then are, of course, the questions related to LDCs, etc. In the chat box, some very interesting observations are there, and I found that observations are mostly on tracks that are important for us, particularly in terms of access, and people are interested to know how those regional dimensions can be sort of addressed related to technology transfer. So I would stop here. Even ICMR and others can also be picked up. So like the public sector institutions, which is more a national sort of agenda on what role public sector institutions can play in enabling this. So I think, Chair, with these points, we can quickly go around the table, whoever wants to pick up this or any other point that I might have missed. And then in next few minutes, with your closing remarks, we can end.
I think the best way to utilize our time would be to ask each of the panelists to quickly address some of the issues which they find important and can address in a few minutes. So, Professor Correa first.
Well, thank you very much. It has been an extremely rich discussion. So thank you very much for the speakers. Well, there is a lot to be said, but since we don't have too much time, I will just focus on a few. The first one is what Ambassador Carim said about the model of innovation. I think is the most important area in which we need to work. This has been discussed before, even in the context of the World Health Organization. The problem is that we have a model of innovation which is based on the monopolization of the outcomes of innovation and not of the access to. So we need a new model of innovation for pharmaceuticals, which would ensure that the outcomes are public goods and not goods which are appropriated, the patents or other intellectual property rights. I think we need to continue this conversation, and COVID-19, I think, has given proof, as was mentioned, that this is needed. Regarding Article 31 bis, I think there is a need for reform. In fact, in my view, export may be allowed under Article 30 as an exception. So manufacturing only for the purpose of exporting, maybe one of the provisions, one of the exceptions under Article 30. So this is something that I would like to elaborate more with some colleagues. Regarding the coverage of the waiver to vaccines, and this seems to be apparently the intent of the United States. As you have mentioned, Ambassador, maybe the solution will not come through a vaccine, but through a treatment. And therefore, it's imperative to ensure that the waiver, if adopted, covers not only vaccines, but other products, in particular medicines. Regarding whether other provisions should be incorporated into the waiver, I would say that negotiating as it is would be already be complex. I think that additional provisions may be needed one in order to prevent that free trade agreements may be used, because it may happen that governments accept a waiver, but there will still obligations under free trade agreements to protect patents, copyright, etc. So you need to waive that also, and there may be some wording that might be considered in order to ensure that there is full consistency in the conduct of the governments that eventually accept a waiver. And also, I think it's very important how the courts will apply when a waiver is dictated, because the courts will still continue to apply the national laws. So it might be very important to ensure that in the waiver there is also the right to recognize for members to deny, in particular, preliminary injunctions that may stop any action that the company may start for production of vaccines or other medicine. There was a question about if the waiver is not adopted, what are the options? One option is Article 73B of the TRIPS agreement. This is a national security exception that the South Center actually, when the COVID-19 crisis started, we did a call to WIPO and WTO to consider this possibility, and I think this is still there. If there is no waiver, then governments should go and use this national security exception that will allow them to suspend all obligations under the TRIPS agreement without implications in terms of possible complaints by other members. Well, thank you very much again for this very, very rich discussion.
Thank you. The next is Ambassador Carim, please, in the order of the speaker. Yes, now we can see you, Ambassador.
Well, thanks very much. And it's really been a really rich discussion, and I learned a lot as you did, Jayant. I think, I mean, from my perspective and being in government and looking at it from the point of view of where we are in the negotiating process in Geneva, I think two things occur. The first is that despite everything, despite all the complications in getting the negotiations moving, the proposal for the waiver has been the catalyst for a much bigger discussion about the TRIPS and whether I like the words that were used, whether or not it's fit for purpose. And I think all of the points that have been made in different ways all indicate that the agreement as it stands now is not suited for us to respond as we need to this type of unprecedented crisis. So it's put that on the table, and so there's an enormous debate on that. And it boils down to, in my view, the debate between whether or not the TRIPS and the knowledge associated with vaccine production is for commercial purposes, primarily on the one hand, or in the service of a public good. And that's the argument that we're advancing, is that it's a global public good, and everything should be in the service of trying to respond to the pandemic. What the problem that we have is that we're in a negotiating process, and we're in the WTO, and Jayant, you know it very well. I mean, in order to get anything agreed there, you need consensus. So everyone has to agree. And that's where the kind of compromises and deals have to be made. And that's going to be the challenge, is to what extent we can move towards getting something that is valuable in a relatively short space of time, or take a very hard line on it and insist, and then not have anything that comes out. So bearing that in mind, I mean, I think the point that Carlos has just raised about Article 73B, the national security exception, is something that I think we'd want to look at. But you know, the problem with all of these things is that we are in a global system where there is extensive power at play in different ways. You mentioned 301. There are all kinds of other instruments that powerful governments can bring to bear in the to advance their interests, and so those are, you know, we have to take those into account. So I think we're in a difficult moment. My call would be particularly would be, I think this would be a South African general approach, is that the role of civil society in stepping up pressure is going to be critical as we try to build more and more support for the waiver amongst other governments. But we still have a long way to go in trying to get something that is valuable in this respect. So just some thoughts. I think it was really, I'm really happy that, thankful that I was invited to this discussion today. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Professor Dutfield, please.
I'll just be brief about technology transfer. It seems to be an act of remarkable bad faith to sign conventions with tech transfer provisions, and they say, well, there's nothing we can do because industry owns all the IP. You know, I mean, why do you? You know, it is extremely bad faith to do this, and needs to be called out. You know? Of course, it's also true that quite a lot of the technologies are in some way or another partly or entirely paid for by taxpayers. You know, government expenditure is behind quite a lot of this, more than is often given credit for. And you look at the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who says so much actually government does is such a big driver of innovation. You know. And innovation and government want to see innovation, as I understand, which is innovation is all about access. At the end of the day, you know, it's a whole process ending in access. Without access, for me, there's no innovation. You have to have the access as part of the definition, you know, of innovation. So, you know, taxpayers, you know, government actually do have obligations, and they have a stake. They actually have paid for quite a lot of this actually already. If you go back historically about sort of sharing technology as if this has never been done before, well, wartime, in war, anything goes. In the First World War, the British and Americans just helped themselves to the US, German patents and trademarks, to help themselves. And it launched the US or chemical industry. It was certainly a big impetus for the British one. In 1944, 45, you know, penicillin, the US government forced universities and industry to share everything, share know-how, everything, because there was a war on. Well, in this occasion, you know, there is not a war, but we have an enemy, which is this virus. And why can't we just think beyond our national boundaries and say we have a collective interest, a collective responsibility to do everything we can to get rid of this virus? You know, why can't we do whatever needs to be done? So, sorry, a bit rhetorical, but you know, it sometimes I can't help it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dutfield. Dr. Thambisetty, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I think just one point I might make here is I've learned so much in the meeting already, and it occurs to me that we shouldn't underestimate the power of agenda setting. And for such a complex and technical area, putting out detailed measures that governments can take now at present, I think would be very helpful. This could be part of the waiver process, the negotiating process, or completely outside of it. There are two documents that come to mind that could be potential templates. One is the Patent Declaration on Regulatory Sovereignty, which was co-authored by about 40 different IP academics, which is an incredibly useful resource on TRIPS flexibilities. There was also the Bonn guidelines that helped bring about the Nagoya Protocol into existence in the form it did. And I think these sorts of measures are quite critical. One, because it's very prosaic, it actually gives information on what can be done now, but also I think it will keep the momentum and give the advantage of agenda setting to the countries that are proposing the waiver the waiver text.
Thank you. Ms. Menghaney, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to highlight two of the questions that came through the chat, which was really, I thought, very interesting. One was from Archana Jatkar from Indian Pharmaceutical Association about the regulatory barriers and about, issues relating to regulatory barriers. And I think there is a resistance, and we have to admit it honestly, towards transparency and disclosure in our own regulatory bodies. If you look at the Indian CDSCO, you will always see that they need to do more on transparency and disclosure. And one of the reasons they do less on transparency and disclosure, and they have an excuse to do less on that, is they always put up Article 39.3 as an excuse for not being transparent and disclosing what should be in the public domain. So actually, one of the reasons why the waiver is so useful is just making government officials more accountable to the public about the regulatory decisions they have taken. Number two is this, I will highlight one of the examples of, my experience of working in India, is that the Indian CDSCO by default does not actually apply the BOLAR provision. So when you had Remdesivir produced by a generic company who was not a licensee of Gilead, they denied registration. And the very same producer went on to supply Cipla and become a contract manufacturer for Cipla, because Cipla was a licensee and Cipla got registration. I don't think so. The Indian CDSCO understands TRIPS flexibilities at all, and this is a very crucial problem that India has. And that is why I think Article 39.3, because you can't go and explain the BOLAR provision or TRIPS flexibility to each government official. So I think it's much better we have the waiver, and we can cite that as an exclusion from regulatory barriers. Number two is what Athira raised. She's a TB activist just as I am, and we've had huge resistance to compulsory licensing. Much of the resistance has been built into our subconscious by the 301 and other actions that developed countries have the kind of psychological pressure on us not to touch compulsory licensing, and we are seeing that impact now roll in. And for them to turn around and say, but you can use it, I think the damage is done. Most countries, policymakers just don't know that they can actually use compulsory licensing. And that's why you saw the contradictory messages from Dr. Vinod Paul from the Niti Aayog, who pretty much actually undermine and use IFPMA or PHRMA speaking points in his myth and fact, unfortunately for us. And you see the contradictory opinions coming out from government officials, because they think talking about compulsory licenses will offend the US, will offend the USTR, will offend the European Commission. And they don't know what's happening at the international level. So for me, the waiver just sort of undoes a lot of that damage that's been played out over the years psychologically on us.
Thank you. I don't think I have either the expertise or we have the time to summarize what we have just discussed. It has been a very rich, very fruitful discussion, and I have personally learned a lot from this. And I hope the panelists will share, if possible, a brief summary of what they have mentioned, if at all. or the RIS can circulate the essential points that have been made by the different panelists. We look forward to the next session next month, Saturday. And without further ado, I would now request Mr. Ravi Srinivas to please deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, good afternoon. Good evening to the participants. I thank Professor Sachin for his encouragement and for helping me at South Center to organize such a short notice. First of all, it's our great pleasure to have Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta as the chair. He's the right person, who has got his experience in WTO-related issues. And it's my pleasure to thank Professor Carlos Correa, Executive Director, South Center, Professor Graham Dutfield, Leeds University, Ambassador Xavier Carim of South African government, Dr.Siva Thambisetty of LSE, and Leena Menghaney of Médecins. It's indeed a good pleasure to have these experts talking in detail, explaining all the intricacies involved, and also looking at various dimensions of the TRIPS waiver, and then still making a very strong and good case for TRIPS waiver and telling that how we can go about it. In fact, given the short time we had and given the short notice at which this is organized, it is really a great thing that we have been able to get such a wide view of opinions and also some of the very perspectives that are practically important. It's not just theory we are talking about. We're also talking about how to go about what are the next steps, what the governments can do, what can be done at the WTO itself. So in that way, I think this webinar has taken us a step forward in the TRIPS waiver proposal, so that now we have some clarity on this. And collaborating with South Center, RIS will be organizing 3 more webinars in the coming Saturdays. And I'm quite sure that all the 3 webinars will have different perspectives in different regions, looking more specifically into the regional issues, regional views, and then how each region the stakeholders want to address TRIPS waiver issues, as well as combine their regional priorities and regional preoccupations with access to medicines, access to vaccines in the context of COVID. I thank everyone once again for this, their presence, and then for very encouraging and interactive participation. It's indeed our pleasure to host such a webinar and short notice. I thank once again everyone for their kind contribution. We look forward to your continuous engagement with you all in the same series, as well as in other webinars which RIS has been doing. As you all know, that RIS works on a couple of other issues as well, not just on TRIPS and waiver. We also have a lot of other programs on health issues as well, particularly related to SDGs. So thank you all once again. It's my pleasure to thank you all again. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a very nice day and a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.